The Collision, China, America, and What Comes Next. Episode 1. The Rise, How China Became a Superpower. Picture the year 1980. The Cold War is still dominating the headlines, disco is on its way out, and the global economic order looks fairly settled. Everyone seems to know where they stand. In that year, the entire economy of China, a country with roughly 1 billion people, was smaller than the economy of Italy. Let that sink in. A nation with nearly a quarter of the entire human race, its total economic output eclipsed by a European peninsula with a fraction of that population. In 1979, China's GDP was just 7% of the United States. 7%. Today, China is the world's second largest economy, roughly two-thirds the size of America's, and 2.5 times larger than Japan's. It is a dominant technological force, an industrial juggernaut, and a rapidly expanding military power. That transformation, from one of the poorest, most isolated places on Earth to a superpower capable of challenging the United States, usually takes centuries. China did it in the span of a single human lifetime. How? That is the question this episode answers. And to answer it properly, we cannot start in the 1970s when the economic charts go vertical. The charts tell you what happened. They don't tell you why. To understand the psychological engine driving China's rise, we have to go back much further, to the very foundation of how China sees itself and its place in the world. The Middle Kingdom. For millennia, China did not look at a map and see itself as one nation-state among many equals. It viewed itself as civilization itself. The Chinese name for China, Zhongguo, is often translated as Middle Kingdom. But the word middle here doesn't mean geographically sandwiched between two places. It means the center of everything between heaven and earth. The Chinese emperor presided over a concept called Tianxia, all under heaven. Surrounding states like Korea and Vietnam were part of a tributary system. They were not treated as sovereign equals, but as subservient entities expected to acknowledge the moral and political superiority of the Chinese court. When your society operates for thousands of years with the belief that it is the sun and everyone else is merely an orbiting planet, that creates something very specific, an assumption of permanent preeminence. And for a very long time, the reality matched the belief. For centuries, China actually was the largest, wealthiest, and most technologically advanced civilization on the planet, inventing paper currency, gunpowder, and the compass. As recently as the 1820s, China accounted for roughly 1/3 of global GDP. This matters enormously for understanding modern China. When today's Chinese leadership looks at the world, they are not seeing the story of a poor nation suddenly rising. They see the story of a restoration, a return to the natural order of things, reclaiming a status that was stolen from them. Which raises the obvious question: what happened to drag them down to the point where their economy was smaller than Italy's? Hadrstad, the Century of Humiliation. The answer begins in 1839, with a violent collision between the most powerful civilization in Asia and an industrialized mercantile Western Europe. The British Empire had a massive trade deficit with China. They were importing Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain in vast quantities, but China was largely self-sufficient and had little interest in buying anything back. So British merchants did something extraordinary. They essentially became a state-backed narcotics cartel, smuggling thousands of chests of opium into China and deliberately creating a massive public health crisis to generate demand. When the Qing court tried to enforce its own laws and destroyed a stockpile of opium, Britain dispatched modern steam-powered gunboats. The resulting war was an absolute slaughter. The technological gap was devastating. In 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of what the Chinese still call the unequal treaties. China was compelled to cede Hong Kong in perpetuity, pay massive silver indemnities for a war Britain had started, and open ports entirely on British terms. But the military defeat was only the beginning. One of the most humiliating mechanisms in those treaties was a legal concept called extraterritoriality. If a British sailor assaulted a Chinese citizen, local police had zero jurisdiction. The sailor could only be tried by a British official. The Chinese were second-class citizens in their own country. In 1860, British and French troops marched into Beijing and burned the Imperial Summer Palace to the ground. Foreign warships were granted the right to patrol deep inside China's inland rivers. An American destroyer cruised 200 miles up the Yangtze River as recently as 1948, a daily visible reminder of China's weakness, playing out in its own heartland. And then came the deepest blow of all, not from a European empire, but from Japan. Historically, Japan had been viewed as a lesser peripheral state in the Chinese orbit, a cultural borrower, not a rival. But Japan had modernized aggressively. In 1894, Japanese forces crushed the Chinese military, seized Taiwan, and forced China to recognize Japanese dominance over Korea. Losing to the British was one thing. Losing to a former vassal state right next door was something else entirely. It triggered an existential crisis. The full-scale Japanese invasion that followed in 1937 resulted in somewhere between 14 and 20 million Chinese deaths. This entire period, from the First Opium War through the Japanese occupation, is what China calls the Century of Humiliation. And it is not ancient history in Beijing. It is present, living memory, the psychological bedrock on which the modern Chinese state is built. The concept has a name, Wuwang Guoqi. Never forget our national humiliation. It is the bedrock of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. Their foundational myth is that they are the saviors who finally ended the humiliation. When Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic in 1949, he declared, "The Chinese people have stood up. The foreigners are gone. The country is unified. The party's mandate to rule rests entirely on the promise that they alone can ensure China is never subjugated again." This fundamentally changes how you negotiate with China. When every trade dispute echoes the Opium War, the stakes are not merely economic, they are existential. The party's first 3 decades in power were not a story of triumph. They were a story of catastrophic self-inflicted wounds. To be fair, the early years brought some genuine baseline improvements, simply because warfare had stopped. Life expectancy jumped from around 48 years in 1949 to roughly 75 years by the time Mao died. But economically, the country remained in suffocating poverty, driven by Mao's obsession with ideological purity over practical results. Mao believed that to build socialism, you had to fundamentally alter human nature. He treated governance like a perpetual revolution machine. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward, a utopian campaign to surpass British steel production within 15 years, using nothing but raw manpower. Farmers across China were ordered to abandon their fields and smelt steel in backyard furnaces. They burned their own furniture and doors for fuel. What they produced was piles of useless, brittle pig iron, a staggering misallocation of resources that destroyed agriculture to generate garbage metal. Meanwhile, local officials, terrified of being purged for underperformance, lied. They reported record-breaking surpluses to Beijing. The state, believing the numbers, requisitioned its share of grain to feed the cities and export abroad to pay off debts. The peasants were left with nothing. The famine that followed, from 1959 to 1962, killed an estimated 30 to 45 million people. It is the largest man-made famine in recorded history. Then came the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This was a war on the mind. Mao weaponized China's youth, the Red Guards, to destroy what he called the Four Olds. Old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Students beat their own teachers. Intellectuals were tortured in public struggle sessions. Universities were shut down. Historical artifacts were destroyed. The education system collapsed. The economy ground to a halt because political frenzy had completely eclipsed productive work. When Mao died in 1976, China was an exhausted, traumatized shell. 80% of the population lived on roughly $40 a year. The Communist Party faced a stark choice: change course or collapse. Harsh Deng Xiaoping and the Great Experiment. Enter Deng Xiaoping. Deng was a veteran revolutionary with a quality Mao had never possessed: aggressive pragmatism. Having been purged twice himself, he knew firsthand where fanaticism led. His philosophy was simple and revolutionary in its simplicity. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. He launched Reform and Opening in 1978. His method was equally pragmatic: crossing the river by feeling the stones, one careful step at a time. He started with agriculture, Peasant families were given long-term leases on land through the household responsibility system. The state kept a quota, purchased at a fixed low price, but anything farmers grew beyond that quota, they could sell for profit. Overnight, a capitalist profit motive was injected on top of the socialist baseline. Production skyrocketed. Next, Deng targeted light, labor-intensive manufacturing, textiles, toys, consumer goods, to put China's ocean of cheap labor to work. But unlike Japan or South Korea, which had protected their domestic industries from foreign competition, China did something bolder. It actively courted foreign direct investment. The problem was obvious. How do you invite capitalists into a communist economy without triggering a political revolt? Deng's answer was the Special Economic Zone, an airlock. Places like Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong, where the standard rules of the communist economy simply did not apply. Inside the SEZs, foreign corporations received tax breaks and cheap land. China, in return, received something far more valuable, a masterclass in modern capitalism, supply chain management, and technology transfer. The rest of the country watched and learned. The results were staggering. Over the following 4 decades, 800 million people were lifted out of poverty, the largest and fastest reduction in human poverty in the entire history of civilization. How the party controls a capitalist economy. But this raises the defining question of modern China. How does an authoritarian one-party state manage a capitalist economy without losing control? The answer is that the Chinese Communist Party is not simply the government. It is a parallel nervous system that penetrates every institution in the country. For every state official, there is a party secretary who holds the real power. Any organization with more than 3 party members, including private corporations, must form a party cell. Those cells ensure that corporate strategy never fundamentally conflicts with the party's grand objectives. Personnel control is the key mechanism. The CCP's organization department maintains a monopoly on elite appointments, from provincial governors to the CEOs of the country's largest companies. You do not reach the top of any major institution in China without the party's approval. This gives Beijing extraordinary leverage over an economy it does not directly own. For decades, the primary performance metric, the KPI if you will, was GDP growth. This created a fiercely competitive internal meritocracy, with provincial officials competing to attract investment and generate growth. And when national coordination was needed, the system could mobilize resources at a speed no democratic government could match. It is how China built the world's largest high-speed rail network. It is how Beijing navigated the 2008 global financial crisis while Western economies convulsed. Xi Jinping and the China Dream. Then came 2012 and Xi Jinping. Xi inherited Deng's economic miracle and its toxic side effects. Systemic corruption had infected the entire system. Military ranks were literally being bought and sold for cash. Xi concluded, correctly, that if the party did not kill corruption, corruption would kill the party. He launched an anti-corruption campaign targeting, in his words, both tigers and flies, high-ranking elites and low-level bureaucrats alike. It was a genuine campaign against a genuine problem. It was also a masterstroke of political consolidation. Xi used the campaign to dismantle the networks of his rivals and concentrate power in his own hands in a way China had not seen since Mao. In 2018, he removed the 2-term limit on the presidency, signaling that he intends to rule indefinitely. Xi's economic vision is equally centralized. Where Deng invited the world in and let the market guide development, Xi wants China to own the technology of the future rather than merely assemble it. This is the logic of Made in China 2025, a state-directed industrial blueprint to dominate high-tech sectors, including artificial intelligence, robotics, semiconductors, and electric vehicles, backed by massive state subsidies. Foreign companies operating in China increasingly find themselves competing not against other companies, but against the bottomless pockets of the Chinese state. And internationally, there is the Belt and Road Initiative, a vast network of infrastructure loans and construction projects sprawling across Asia, Africa, and Europe, rewiring global trade routes toward Beijing. By lending billions to developing nations, China gains diplomatic leverage and constructs a modern sphere of influence without firing a single shot. The destination of all this has a name, the China Dream. Xi calls it the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, with a target date of 2049, the centenary of the People's Republic. Rejuvenation is a precise and deliberate word. It signals not something new, but a return to the golden age of the Middle Kingdom, when China was the center of everything. But history had taught Beijing one more painful lesson. Wealth without power makes you a target. The Century of Humiliation began not when China was poor, but when it was rich and militarily weak. Xi has not forgotten. Two events in the 1990s shocked the military out of complacency. The 1991 Gulf War, in which the United States dismantled the world's fourth-largest army in a matter of weeks using what Chinese analysts called American magic. GPS, stealth bombers, precision munitions that felt like science fiction to a military still relying on infantry and unguided artillery. And the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when U.S. aircraft carriers sailed off China's coast with total impunity, and Beijing could do nothing but watch. Xi has since reorganized the entire People's Liberation Army into joint theater commands designed to project power outward and to establish credible deterrence against the United States. The final paradox. China's rise is an alchemy of extraordinary elements. The demographic weight of 1.4 billion people, Deng's fierce pragmatism, the CCP's unmatched capacity for state coordination, and the emotional fuel of restorative nationalism. A civilization that genuinely believes it is not rising, but returning. But the rise has produced a paradox that Xi Jinping has not yet resolved. To function as a 21st century superpower, China must master the universal tools of global power: international finance, advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and global supply chains, all systems built on openness, interconnection, and the free flow of information. Yet China's political identity is built on being culturally and politically unique, separate, sovereign, and self-contained. The Great Firewall keeps the internet out. The party controls the narrative inside. Can China wall off its society while simultaneously pursuing technological modernization? Or will the technology, the connectivity, the information, the exposure to the outside world that modernity demands eventually change the nature of the Middle Kingdom from the inside out? That tension sits at the heart of everything that follows in this series. In our next episode, we turn to the economic war, the invisible conflict already being fought in banking servers, semiconductor factories, and supply chain boardrooms. A war of chips and dollars that most people have no idea is already raging. Stay curious.